Investor Connect podcast program. This is Hall T. Martin. I'm the host of the show, in which we interview angel investors, venture capital, private equity, family offices, and many other investor groups for startups and growth companies. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for joining us. Well, hello, this is Hall Martin with Investor Connect. Today we're here with Eric Bielke, who is a longtime investor in the enterprise space, who is currently with GE Ventures. Eric, thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me here.
So what was your background before investing in early stage companies? What did you do before?
I actually had maybe two chapters, early career. I was a consultant for a company called Charles River Associates. Some people know it now. I think when I joined them, it wasn't all that well known. It was a small firm in Boston that was trying to go head to head with some of the bigger firms that are better known, like McKinsey and BCG and Bain and others. And it was actually, you might say, one of the early firms to be doing data science. I think we've now used that term liberally, but back at the time I was doing it, it was just plain statistics. But we were really just running models against large data sets and trying to tease out insight for businesses around pricing, maybe around what markets to launch in and where to steer clear of, and taking a very quantitative approach to traditional consulting. I did that for a few years. And like a lot of people in that industry, I ended up doing an MBA. I was at the University of Chicago for a couple of years to follow that, and then turned to actually running a small business. Found a couple of co-founders in the Chicago area. And while I was in school, spent some time building a company called SoCore Energy, which at the time was part of the red hot boom in solar and distributed energy. And this was around about 2008. We got together a small team, raised a little bit of venture capital from some angel investors and a couple of VCs that were in the Chicago area, and then built a small business leasing solar panels out of that. The business went through some turbulent times, as the startups do. The end of 2008 was a particularly turbulent time. We saw a lot of the financial firms that were innovating in the energy space as well as elsewhere, if not fold up shop, at least take a pause with respect to what they were willing to do for creative new term sheets. But we weathered through it. Eventually, the business was sold to Edison International, which is a large utility firm. And Edison continues to deploy solar installations on rooftops today. So good outcome. But I didn't stay, I suppose, as an entrepreneur for too long. I joined kind of the VC industry in about 2012 and initially focused a lot on energy investments and what was kind of this emerging area of IoT, and honestly spent the last 7 years kind of at a intersection of what I call the digital and physical worlds, which is where does IT meet legacy industries, whether they be energy or aerospace or healthcare. GE has been across a lot of these industries for quite some time. And there's been a lot of, I think, change that's happened in these big kind of monolithic industries that have taken years to develop into small oligopolies that are now held by a few leading incumbents. And some of that industry dynamic is starting to shift in favor of startups, and it's been exciting to see.
Well, that's great. So what excites you right now?
Lately, I've been spending a lot of time in what I call the aerospace segment generally, but what I'd say is maybe more colloquially called new space or space tech. That's everything from the 100 meters off the ground, which people would classify kind of as drones or unmanned aerial systems, to geostationary orbit, where you're hundreds, thousands of kilometers off the ground, and dealing with satellites and imagery as well as communication systems that beam down to Earth. One of the reasons that space is super interesting right now is, number one, there's a lot of new players. It used to be that space was dominated by basically Boeing and the United Launch Alliance, and there were a handful of large U.S. or European firms that built satellites or launched satellites. And one of the key new people on the block was Elon Musk, as much as people, I think, have a sometimes love, sometimes hate relationship with Elon. SpaceX really brought the idea that a startup could enter the industry and be successful to the fore, and ushered in a lot of new companies that have been across from launch to building of satellites to processing of information that's coming off satellites so we can do interesting things here on Earth. And a lot of that actually is impactful to some of these legacy industries that we've been interested in looking at.
So for the new space tech sector, what's your advice for people that want to invest in that space? What would you tell them before they write that first check?
Well, I think you can categorize the industry, and I'm being very loose with these categorizations. I'm sure there's somebody out there that could critique any one of the next couple of things that I'll say. But let's say that there's 3, maybe 4 segments in what I'll call new space, right? There's a whole set of problems associated with getting satellites or other components, including passengers, into space, right? We'll loosely call that launch and launch operations. And there's a second category, which is once you've got an orbiting satellite, there's a whole set of operational challenges associated with making that productive. And these are organizations that own or manage constellations. Planet is a great example of this kind of company that's working towards having hundreds of satellites that are all within its operational domain in space that are primarily doing imagery, but I think Planet has some opportunities to do some things beyond that as well. And then there's a cluster of organizations that are working against the communications side of things, which are also operators of satellites, but a different type. And in that group, you would include SpaceX itself, which has a relatively new constellation they're trying to get off the ground. You might say that Blue Origin is also eventually in that category. And then you got really long-standing or would-be long-standing players like OneWeb in the kind of startup group around communications and associated companies that are trying to figure out how do we get data relays to be faster in space. And then the fourth category, I'd say, is organizations that aren't operating satellites or even building them, but are just taking the data that comes down to process. And there are a handful of very relatively well-known startups that are doing this as well. Planet kind of bleeds into this area. Orbital Insight is a group that's taking imagery from orbiting satellites and then using that to determine if changes have happened on Earth. Let's say it's a change in crop moisture. That's a signal to farmers that maybe there's a necessary remedy or there's disease approaching. You can do these kinds of large-scale imagery analytics now, which you weren't able to do 10, 15 years ago due to lack of processing power and frankly, just lack of the data to begin with. And there's some really interesting insights you can get off that imagery. And then when we think about one of the areas that we're excited about, I think that last category we'll probably spend the most time in. And there's been a proliferation of really interesting companies all trying to find a specific problem to solve with this proliferation of new imagery and data that's coming out of space.
So for those who are running startups in this sector, what's your advice for them? Or maybe another way to ask it, what mistake do you see most often made for startups going into this new space tech sector?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we've had the good fortune of being able to talk to a lot of different groups and I think watch the adolescence, as it were, of the startup ecosystem around imagery analytics. And I'll talk maybe about imagery analytics in particular, since I think that's probably the area that some people know best and where there's maybe been the most robust development. The original thesis 5 years ago was if there were a handful of orbiting satellites and there was going to be a proliferation of new imagery data, be the provider of as much of that analysis possible to whomever. And sort of customers would call and you'd just have a problem to solve in oil and gas. You'd have a problem to solve in mining. You have a problem to solve in vehicles and transportation. You might have a problem to solve in civil infrastructure. Lots of different industries might approach a provider of image detection and change detection to figure out if they can drive some market and sell. And I think what we've seen, and this is part and parcel of advice I'd give to anyone trying to enter this space, is there's a lot of value to being focused and almost to the point of being really niche. So a great example is a company called Descartes Labs that some people may know. It's based out of New Mexico. They've been primarily focused on agriculture and crop forecasting or yield forecasting. And that's to the exclusion of a lot of the possible applications for satellite imagery. The probably best known application is detection of where there are movements of military goods and services or movement of ships in foreign countries. And certainly there are groups that are processing that and doing a lot of work, not only on behalf of the U.S. government, but also on behalf of other governments. And Descartes has been successful, I think, because they've not just steered clear of one of those segments. So the defense area is certainly very interesting for satellite imagery, but they've been laser focused on just doing agriculture. And they've really refined a crop forecast that's gotten to the point of being one of the most kind of widely looked at numbers and supersedes in many ways state-sponsored data, whether that's from the United States or that's from other countries. And that would be, I think, a good focus or good thing for other potentially new entrants to come into. And I think there's still a lot of open spaces in the satellite imagery processing area, certainly around mining. That's seen some activity, but a lot of opportunity there, relatively untapped. I think there's probably room for focusing on what I call civil infrastructure, which change detection in cities. There's been, I think, a good bit of discussion around whether or not you could build some models for helping to monitor construction in at scale through satellite imagery processing. So be focused, I guess, is the one thing we've learned a little bit. I tend to like the downstream analytics side of things because it's a little more capital efficient than some of the satellite operators, although the economics of satellite operation are really interesting for those that can kind of break through the need to raise a good bit of capital in order to get units up. But yeah, that's my sense of how to be successful if you're trying to look at entering the aerospace or satellite imagery space in particular, is choose a niche and a single kind of customer and really refine your models to work with that group.
Well, that's great advice for this sector and probably most every other sector as well. And it sounds like there's a lot of opportunity here, which can distract people away. But as you watch this industry, which you described in really good detail a moment ago, how is the industry evolving? What changes are you seeing out there occur?
Well, the one maybe most notable change is that if you cycle back 10 years, we had primarily publicly funded satellites in orbit. And the only satellites that were launched were either from Europe, the US, or Russia. And China's been participating in a space race more recently, but we really didn't have, one, a lot of satellites up, and two, a lot of dispersion of information that might entitle, say, new nation states to have their own space program. And one of I think the biggest changes has been that the cost of putting satellites in orbit has come down so much that now there's opportunities for countries, say, like South Africa or Kenya or nation states in the Middle East to procure imagery and have a kind of a low-cost space program, which wasn't possible before. Now, it doesn't mean launching astronauts into space, and there's a lot of things that I guess established space programs from more established nation states have had going for a while, but it is now possible to actually have a space intelligence service at the scale of buying images for what amounts to hundreds or thousands of dollars a piece, and basically the budget of a startup analytical service. That's a really big change. And I think what we'll see more of in the future is continued proliferation of that amount of data and the ever lowering cost of having access to a pseudo space program. And it will mean democratization of what had been a lot of military intelligence before now to lots of different countries.
Well, great. So based on your knowledge of this sector, what's your investment thesis for it?
Well, we've been focused primarily on looking at opportunities in the downstream, what I'll call the downstream analytics side, which is organizations that are taking data that's being built by satellite operators and using machine learning algorithms and the bolus of capabilities that's come out of the computer vision industry, if you could call it that, over the last few years. And I think we'll continue to spend time there. I'm certainly excited about the amount of opportunities in that category. I think there's a lot of industries that benefit from having an intelligence product about what's going on in the non-digital world to what's happening in the physical world, whether that be pumps operational in the field, manufacturing operations going on, power plants, operational, non-operational. If you think about the number of publications out there that strictly focus on providing competitive intelligence to all industry participants, let's take IHS Markit as a good example, right? It does a great job at talking about how much of a given chemical is bound to be on the market at any given time and what demand for that looks like, and then trying to do some forecasting and pricing. That's really important information if you're in the chemicals industry. The challenge that IHS Markit has, and I don't mean to pick on IHS Markit, that's a terrific firm, and I think they do a great job at the prognostication. But sometimes you're dealing with inaccurate data because it's reported by, let's say, public services that try and get it right, or maybe in the case of sometimes in Asia, they don't try super hard to get it right. And it's the best available. It's oftentimes also available only at the end of the month or at the end of the quarter when those publicly reported figures come out. The opportunity with geospatial data is it's all the time. If a plant goes down along the Gulf Coast and it's producing 1%, say, of the world's bleach, you'll know that instantly. And the anticipated price response, you'll know that instantly as well. That kind of insight, I think, is going to be more and more meaningful as time goes on. And these use cases for observation of the physical world, I think we'll start to find new industries to plug into. And so we're pretty excited about the long tail to startup opportunities that are working in geospatial data.
Great. Are there one or two startups that fit that thesis?
Well, I mentioned one, and this is an organization that GE does not have a position in. Descartes Labs is a great group. I think Space No, which is based out of New York, is a great group, focused on a couple of different areas, but all around heavy industry. Orbital Insight is a great group. They're in the Bay Area. There's, I think, been more focused a little bit on defense and intelligence, but they've got a great line of products. There are increasingly, I think, opportunities for new firms as well to focus on some of these niche areas. But without highlighting any organizations that we're in active dialogue with, I'd say that those are three great organizations that have landed a beachhead in their respective industries.
So let's talk about the challenges in this new space tech sector. It seems like there might be a lot of regulatory and certainly a lot of technical challenges, maybe even marketing challenges. What would you call the top challenges that you see startups going through?
Yeah, and I'll caveat this answer by saying I think in some ways we've seen the tip of the iceberg on the challenges side as well as the opportunity side. The known regulatory barrier for the space industry is ITAR, and ITAR has been the de facto treaty that basically governs what can be launched in space and what can be observed. It's pretty loose, and honestly, the benefits to having communication satellites and television satellites in space to many nation states has kind of overwhelmed the issues around defense and surveillance to some degree that have been part of the reason for having a treaty in place. But there's going to be continued concerns where you get sensitive information off of Earth observation satellites, especially if you get information at what is increasingly a scale that you can recognize something as small as a license plate or something as distinctive as a face, and then being capable of tracking those cars or people through time. And we'll see, I'm sure, upcoming regulation, not just around privacy, but also kind of inter-nation state discussions about what's legitimate use of this commons that we call outer space and what's not, as the commercial and the defense applications blur a little bit together. We haven't seen much in the way of public fight, as it were, I think, between countries over this yet. But as some of this information becomes more and more interesting to look at and starts to run, say, into conflict with publicly reported figures, for example, energy production in China has, I would say, long been considered not publicly reported as accurate. And some of the space-based data gets to a level of accuracy that challenges the publicly reported figures. There's bound to be some tension there. And if that manifests itself as more regulation or less, I'm not sure. But we're going to see some of that turbulence ahead.
Well, that's great. So there are quite a few sectors, subsectors, and applications out there. Are there two or three that you see as immediate opportunities for investors to pursue?
Well, we're interested in the data analytics category, that kind of last of four that I mentioned. I really think it's fascinating to watch what's happening in communications as well. It's not something we've spent a lot of time on yet, but when you look at the size of the opportunity, one of the things that space-based communications, or what is effectively space-based broadband, can do is satellites go all around the Earth, right? They're agnostic to whether you're in the southern tip of South America or you're in downtown Chicago. And Wi-Fi signals and any terrestrial network obviously is sensitive to where the user's location is. We're ushering in a world in which it will be possible to provide broadband at relatively low cost, because the satellites can amortize over very large numbers of people and get that to anywhere in the world, even ships at sea, right? Even in the Arctic. And that's an area that I think is really interesting from a social as well as a commercial perspective. Certainly creates a lot of opportunity for people who are not currently connected and able to do transactions and learn and interact online, to now be able to do that at scale. And there are going to be some interesting, I think, startup opportunities that are going to come out of that. And some of them may be regional, focused on groups that are getting broadband access, perhaps not for the first time, but for the first time at a cost that enables them to really take advantage of the internet. And we'll start to see, I think, applications for always on kind of connectivity. So not necessarily driverless cars, but that's been talked about a lot. I think the need, or rather the opportunity for vehicles to be connected to the internet all the time, may create some interesting ideas for streaming applications that they don't necessarily reflect autonomous driving, but might be for entertainment in the car. There's a lot of ways in which the last 30 years of broadband access has shown us that the application might not be there yet, but as soon as you expand the pipe and you make it more ubiquitous or easier to get broadband and the out of doors, people find a way to take advantage of it. And so seeing that trend continue, I think when we've got 24/7 broadband virtually around the world, people are going to find some clever ways to take advantage of that.
Well, that's a good point. Well, in the last few minutes that we have here, what else should we cover that we haven't?
Well, the one thing I'd say that is maybe particularly fascinating to watch now in space that we haven't talked to in any great detail is what I call the big exploration questions. And we've talked about this a lot around the team, although they're less in the way of venture and commercial focused. I think it's super exciting what's being contemplated, not just by NASA, but now by SpaceX and by Blue Origin. But it seems incredibly likely that without too much imagination, we're going to see people landing on Mars and colonies start to materialize, not just on Mars, but potentially on the moon as well. And there are some really science fiction sounding concepts for what do you do with that, from planting the flag, right? And hey, this is something that humanity could accomplish. We should be proud of that. To things like mining of asteroids, which sounds almost fictitious when you hear it the first time. But when you look at the challenges that have been overcome to get us to where we are and how many there are ahead before we can do operations like that in space and maybe use the moon or even Mars as launch pads for things like asteroid mining, it starts to sound a little more real. So I'll borrow a term from Josh Wolf, founder and partner of Lux Capital, that we're watching the science fiction kind of morph into the science. And it's at one part really interesting to just observe as a citizen of the Earth, also really interesting as an investor to see where maybe some opportunities in this whole universe exploration category that has some real potential.
Well, that's great. Well, how best for listeners to get back in touch with you?
So I'm on LinkedIn, got an active Twitter account, and I'm easy to find. I think I've got a reasonably uncommon last name, so I'm easy to look up. And if there are folks out there who are working in this segment and either want to chat about it, or particularly if you're an entrepreneur with an idea in the space and want to reach out, we're super interested in having those conversations and glad to hear business plans and talk openly about what we think.
Well, great. We'll put that in the show notes. Thank you for joining us today and hope to have you back for a follow-up soon, as it sounds like an exciting sector that's progressing fast.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me, all. Really appreciate it.
Investor Connect helps investors interested in startup funding. In this podcast series, experienced investors share their experience and advice. You can learn more at investorconnect.org. Paul T. Martin is the director of Investor Connect, which is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to the education of investors for early-stage funding. All opinions expressed by Hall and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of Investor Connect. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.